Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Liberty.me Live. I'm your host tonight, Mike Reed, and I'm here with Jacob Hornberger, the president of the Future of Freedom Foundation. We're going to talk tonight about Jacob's fascinating Kindle bestseller, The Kennedy Autopsy. I've been storing it here on my Kindle. And welcome, Jacob, and thanks for coming on.
Oh, thank you. It's great to be here. My first time on Liberty.me. I'm excited.
Wonderful. Now, my dear audience, we're going to get right deep into this book, into the mysteries surrounding the Kennedy assassination, the autopsy, how this all connects to liberty movement in general. But I want to give you a little teaser before we really get started. So here's the thing that shocked me most about this book when I read it. On November 22nd, so the day of Kennedy's assassination, after he's been pronounced dead at the hospital, first, his body gets taken elsewhere for an autopsy. That's a little bit weird. And here's what's really weird. When his body arrives at the new hospital for the autopsy, it arrives for the autopsy twice, in two different caskets on the same night. It shows up first in this plain, like, unmarked shipping casket, and then it arrives the second time, just a little while later, in a bronze ornate casket, the same one everybody saw it kind of loaded onto the plane at Dallas in. So the same body arrives at the same hospital, twice, delivered twice, for the same autopsy in the same night. So, like, how is that even possible? So that's the point. As I read the book, that's the point where I really got into it. I really realized I had to pay attention to the whole thing, get all the details here. So, Jacob, don't answer that yet. Don't tell us how that's possible yet. Audience, stay tuned and you'll find out. But first, I want to take just a step back and just get to know Jacob for a moment. Jacob, can you tell us a little bit about who you are and what your organization, the Future Freedom Foundation, is all about?
Yeah, I'm president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, which I founded some 25 years ago. And it's a nonprofit educational foundation. We're libertarians. We advance what we call an uncompromising moral, philosophical, and economic case for the free society. And we do that through a variety of methods, but primarily through the dissemination of ideas, which we have ultimate faith in, the power of ideas, especially ideas on liberty.
Wow. Wow, that's interesting. So how does this book, and indeed you've done a lot of research over the years and a lot of writing on specifically the Kennedy assassination, the autopsy, and those details, but also you've done some work about CIA coups in Latin America especially. How does that kind of detailed historical work fit into what's going on in the Future of Freedom Foundation in general?
Well, most of us get into this movement through the economic side of things. That's certainly the way I got into it. Discovered literature that had been published by the Foundation for Economic Education, and they had a profound impact on me on the welfare state and the notion that we're not really free in this country because of this kind of socialistic economic system, interventionist, mercantilist, corporatist, and that was a big revelation for me when I was in my 20s and I discovered libertarianism. But as time went on, I realized that as bad as it is on liberty, it pales in comparison to the other side of the equation, and that's what we call the warfare state or the national security state. And unfortunately, a lot of libertarians stay stuck only on economic. They have a blind spot to the grave threat to our liberties that are posed by the national security state, a much graver threat. So this caused me to delve much more deeply into the national security state, and at FFF I would say we probably spend 60% of our time on the warfare state and about 40% on economic liberty. And in the context of studying the national security state, the CIA, the military-industrial complex, as President Eisenhower said, the whole standing army, the NSA, you get into the concepts of regime change and assassination. And so right in the middle of this falls the Kennedy assassination. And some libertarians might look at the assassination and say, well, it's something different. It doesn't really fit in with what we're doing. But once you start realizing that it fits perfectly because it was just another regime change operation, no different from other regime change operations that the CIA and the military was doing, then you start realizing, my gosh, this branch of the government really is the most powerful branch, and that's the national security branch.
Wow. Okay, so you were kind of going right away to the big stuff, explaining that you think the best explanation for the assassination and the kind of what happens, the shenanigans in the autopsy and the following investigations, is that the national security state itself, or be that the CIA or the Pentagon or I don't know, the companies that make Agent Orange, were involved in killing Kennedy and then covering up the evidence. Is that right?
Yeah, and that's exactly right. They effected a regime change operation, no different from the one in Guatemala in '54, in Iran in '53, in Chile in '73, and the ones they were trying to effect in Cuba throughout the '60s. And the key to understanding this, or a key to understanding this, is the autopsy, which is why I wrote this book. Because as you look at it, in other words, you can try to come at the assassination from the front side by saying, well, look how many police officers heard shots from the front. And, of course, Oswald was in the rear. So if they're hearing shots from the front, well, that indicates there's more than one shooter here. But what's fascinating about the autopsy is that it comes at the assassination and figuring out what happened sort of from the back angle of this thing after the assassination. And the analysis is this, is that if you look at the evidence of the autopsy and you conclude that a false and fraudulent autopsy was conducted, then that automatically means cover-up. I mean, there's no way to avoid that conclusion. That if they're going to false autopsy, they're doing it for a reason, and there can be only one reason. That's cover-up. Well, that's what the purpose of my book is. The Kennedy Autopsy is to look at that evidence. It doesn't go into theories and conspiracy theories. It just says, let's look at this evidence. And the great weight of the evidence that's come out over the last many, many years, most of it was kept secret, is yes, there was a false and fraudulent autopsy. Well, then that raises the natural questions: is why would they cover up? Who were they trying to cover up for? And that leads directly to themselves, to the national security establishment.
Wow. So let's go to the autopsy itself. Let's go to my teaser about the 2 deliveries of the body to Bethesda Naval Hospital in Maryland, right? Can you talk about kind of the custody of Kennedy's body from the time he dies to the time the autopsy is complete?
Yeah. The way I start out the book is a dramatic episode, and this really is what caught my attention. It is so suspicious that it just boggles the mind. That as soon as Kennedy's declared dead at Parkland Memorial Hospital in Dallas, the medical examiner there in Dallas County decides he's going to conduct an autopsy. Okay, what's an autopsy? An autopsy is an examination by an official pathologist, a certified pathologist, preferably a forensic pathologist, that is going to determine the cause of death. He's going to tell you where the bullet holes are, what the angles were, and so forth. All right, so he says we have to do this under Texas law, and that's what Texas law required, that in any homicide you have to have an autopsy. Lo and behold, a team of Secret Service agents, well-armed, has the body placed in this big, heavy, ornate casket that had been brought over from a funeral home, and starts to wheel this thing out through force. They're pushing people away to get that body into a waiting ambulance. The medical examiner gets in the way and he says, stop, you're not going to do this. We have to do an autopsy. And they brandish their guns. They pull their coats back. They started screaming and yelling, telling them to get out of the way. And according to one of the doctors, Dr. Crenshaw, he says there was no doubt they were going to use these weapons if we tried to stop them. Well, so it's phenomenal because, Mike, ordinarily, don't you expect officers, law enforcement officers, to work with each other that says, hey, yes, sir, Dr. Rose, which is what his name was, we will work with you. Go ahead and do what you need to do under the law because you don't want to jeopardize a criminal prosecution. These guys did that. Well, they get the body to guess who's waiting for it. Lyndon Johnson, the vice president, who is now automatically the president, he's already removing seats from the plane. He's a Texan, native Texan. He knows what the law is, but he's already ordering them to remove seats. And it turns out that the Secret Service was there saying, we're under orders to get this body out.
Huh.
So it's pretty clear, in my opinion, that the logical import of this is that Johnson issued the order, get that body out of there at all costs. because
Right.
he's out moving the seats.
Wow. So, is there anybody else that can issue an order to the Secret Service? I mean, don't they answer to whoever the president is? And does it have to be Johnson?
Well, it doesn't have to be Johnson, but ask yourself, who would issue an order like that and why? You know, if it's the head of the Secret Service, why in the world would he say, get that body out of there at all costs, brandish your guns, do not let anybody interfere with you? It doesn't, the whole thing doesn't make any sense. Now, Johnson's rationale was that he didn't want to leave Dallas without Mrs. Kennedy, and he was just being chivalrous. Well, that doesn't stand to reason either, because for one thing, the man came in on Air Force 2. He switches his plane to Air Force 1. They were essentially duplicates, the two planes. He could have gone back on Air Force 2. He takes over Air Force 1, which was Mr. and Mrs. Kennedy's plane. When she gets on board the plane, she doesn't know that this has happened. She goes to her bedroom. She's just lost her husband about an hour before. And guess who's lying on her bed? Lyndon Johnson himself. I mean, it's just horrible. And so Mr. Chivalry is over here. So it's pretty clear that Johnson wanted that body, and that's what he was waiting there for. I mean, he even conjured up thoughts that this could be a communist conspiracy and so forth. Well, if it's like the first step in a nuclear attack, which was entirely a possibility theoretically, you'd want to get the president up in the air and manage the nuclear retaliation if that was the case and so forth, defending the country. Now, he just sits there on the ground waiting for this body to show up. So to go back to your original question, they fly into Maryland and arrive at around 6 p.m. Eastern Time. And at 6:35 p.m., the body arrives in a cheap shipping casket at Bethesda Morgue in the back way, not in the casket. That bronze ornate casket, who everybody thinks has the president's body in it, is proceeding to the front of the Bethesda Naval Hospital with Kennedy. It's got, you know, a gray ambulance, and everybody thinks, okay, that's where the president is. What was actually happening secretly was that the body was being sneaked in there, and it arrived at 6:35. How do we know this? Well, as a result of hearings that took place in the 70s with the House Select Committee, but especially in the 90s with the Assassination Records Review Board, a number of witnesses came forward and evidence was discovered establishing that the body had arrived early in this cheap shipping caskets. There's eyewitnesses. There's written reports that were contemporaneous, saying, like the head of the Marine Guard there said, yes, we were guarding the entrance there when that casket arrived, the cheap shipping casket. Then you had one of the kind of semi-humorous things. Well, it's not really humorous, but you've got the X-ray technician that has taken X-rays of the president's skull. He's carrying him up, and he gets to the lobby of Bethesda Naval Hospital. He sees Mrs. Kennedy walking in, and outside is the bronze casket in the ambulance. He knows that casket cannot have the president's body in it because he's got the X-rays of the president's head in his hand. So this was the kind of evidence that was going on, that was being discovered. So in order, they had to keep it secret because they were doing shenanigans for that period of time that they secretly had the body in there. But they had to put the body back into the original casket. And so my book explains how they did that. So at 8 o'clock, the official honor guard carries in the bronze casket, and everybody, the public, the reporters are out there watching this happen. And so, but for them, that's the first time it's happened. And the body has been reinserted there, and there's another shenanigan thing as to how they accomplished this. But yeah, the body ends up going in twice, once secretly and the second time publicly.
Wow. So just to recap on that, so they put the body on the plane in the bronze casket, then they swap it to the cheap plane casket, they deliver it to the hospital, they do an autopsy, they do X-rays. Then they put it back in the bronze casket, and then they put it back in the hospital, and they do a second autopsy.
No, they don't do an autopsy when they first get it in there at 6:35.
Okay.
They've got time to do some shenanigans before the autopsy begins.
Okay.
Now because nobody knows it's in there except a select few, but what they're trying to do is hide evidence of shots having been fired from the front. That was the whole purpose of getting the body in there early, so that they could do pre-autopsy surgery that would hide the fact that shots had been fired from the front. And that was because the shooter is in the rear. And so we can't have shots fired from the front. So in that period of time, the pathologists, there were two of them there at the time, they're doing the surgery that's necessary on this body to hide the fact that shots had been fired from the front. Now, another piece of evidence here that was very telling was that the chief pathologist that's doing this, a guy named Humes, he telephones the third pathologist at 8 o'clock, and that's Dr. Fink, and Fink's at home, and he calls Fink and he says, "We need you to come down here and help with the autopsy," because Fink had more experience especially with forensics and stuff. And he tells Fink, "We already have good X-rays of the skull." Now, the body is officially brought in at 8, in the bronze casket where the press is out there and so forth. So you got to ask yourself, how in the world can Humes have X-rays of the skull that have already been developed if the body is arriving for the first time at 8 o'clock, which is what everybody believed for years, for decades? That's what everybody believed. Well, obviously, in order to have solid X-rays, the body had to be in there before that phone call was made at 8 o'clock. And that's what the earlier 6:35 time was.
Wow. Okay. So about the tampering of the body, you call it the shenanigans of the body, or even surgery on the body. Can you explain? I understand that the people who the doctors who treated Kennedy to try and save his life immediately after the assassination talked about one set of wounds, and then the official autopsy that comes out of this two-casket shenanigans we're talking about, that describes a somewhat different set of injuries. Can you explain those two sets?
Yeah, and let me point out that my analysis is primarily based on the best book in this whole Kennedy assassination genre, and that's a book called Inside the Assassination Records Review Board by Douglas P. Horne. It's a 5-volume work. It's the most extensive, complete analysis of the autopsy and actually the entire assassination. Horne served on the Assassination Records Review Board. That was the board that was brought into existence after Oliver Stone's movie JFK came out, and there was a huge public outcry about the secrecy that the government was having over these assassination records. And so the ARRB's mission was to get all these things released. So the ARB orders these things released, and I should also point out that Horne based his book on a book called Best Evidence by David Lifton, which was a New York Times bestseller. And Lifton was the first guy that talked about two lenses. You got the Dallas lens and the Bethesda lens. And so the Dallas doctors saw a huge hole, like a baseball-sized wound in the back of Kennedy's head.
Okay, so the Dallas doctors, those are the guys who treated Kennedy when they were trying to save his life, like immediately after the shots, right?
Exactly.
Okay.
As soon as he's wheeled into the emergency room, he's still alive, and they're treating him, and all of a sudden they look, and he's got this baseball-sized hole in the back of his head, which they knew, for all practical purposes, this was a dead man, even though he may still have a pulse and so forth. They saw cerebellum coming out of that wound, and cerebellum is the part of the brain that's in the lower back of the head. It's a distinct part of the brain. There was this hole there. Now, they weren't the only ones. There were other people, like the Secret Service agent Clint Hill, who jumped on the back of the car to get Jacqueline Kennedy in there right after the shots were fired. And then some of the nurses witnessed this hole. So that was one wound, the back of the head. Then you've got a second wound that came in through the throat, the front of the neck. And immediately after the president was declared dead, the doctors had a press conference, two doctors, and they told the press at this press conference that that this was a wound of entrance, and they specifically said that like 3 times. This is a wound of entrance. Well, then you have the Bethesda lens that when the Horne report comes out, you know, you have this muddled report, but you get the sense. Well, let me jump forward to the House Select Committee on Assassinations. In the 1970s, the House Select Committee opens up the Kennedy investigation again because people are very skeptical about the Warren report, which had been issued back in '64, finding that Lee Harvey Oswald was the only shooter. And of course, Oswald was supposedly firing from the rear. Well, that's contrary to this notion of shot fired from the front, obviously, and a hole in the back of the head, because a big hole denotes a neck wound. Because when a bullet enters the skull, it enters a little tiny hole and then blows out the back. Okay. Well, the House Select Committee issues a report that says all the Bethesda doctors said that the back of the head was intact and that there was a hole in the back of the head that came through, and that was, of course, the magic bullet theory that the hole came through and the back and came through the front and hit Connally. Well, when the ARRB meets in the 1990s, just like the Warren Commission, the House Select Committee ordered a lot of its records kept secret, a lot of its evidence secret, for 50 years. And so the ARRB says, okay, we're not going to have that anymore. We're ordering the release of all Kennedy assassination-related documents, and among these are the evidence at the House Select Committee. Well, it turns out they just lied, because many of the Bethesda doctors said there was a hole in the back of the head. Now, why is this important? Well, if you look at the back of the head in the official photographs that are in the record, it shows the head to be intact. There's no hole there at all. It's just a fully intact head. Now, so that's contrary to what all the Dallas doctors said, and it's contrary to what many of the Bethesda doctors said, contrary to what the House Select Committee had falsely said. And even they couldn't even get their story straight, Mike. One of the pathologists, Boswell, he said that the hole extended from the top of the head all the way to the back of the head, and he actually draws it on a model skull. And no, the back of the head was intact, only the top of the head was gone. And of course, all the doctors in Dallas said the top of the head was fine. The only thing was this hole in the back of the head. Well, okay, so what's going on here? Well, as you read Horne's book, you start realizing that what they were doing is hiding the fact that shots had been fired from the front and making it look like the shots only came from the rear. So they have the Warren report, the official report is, no, the bullet came in the back of the head and blasted out the top of the head. Well, we say that the top of the head was fine, that it was surgery during that period of time the body was deeper in there that removed that top of the head to make it look like a bullet had come out. I mean, it was shocking, the idea that one bullet could blow out the whole top of the head. And then the other thing was that what they did was they enlarged a tracheotomy wound that had been done over the little bullet hole in the front. They shifted through wording in the Warren report, this is where Gerald Ford came in, that the wound had been in the right shoulder in the back. There were witnesses to that. And it's actually even the death certificate is showing the wound is in the back shoulder. Ford in the Warren report moves the back of the neck, and that then gives them the opportunity to argue that the other bullet came back from the back of the neck, came out the front, and hit Connally, magic bullet. It ends up totally pristine, except for a little bit of mashing at its base. There's no blood on the bullet, and it's done all these wounds. It's broken bones, and ribs, and Connally, and yeah. So that was the whole idea of the Bethesda versus Dallas. Was there a hole in the back of the head, or are the photographs falsified, the official photographs falsified, and was the wound in the neck from the front or from the back?
Right. And so these photographs, too, there's something mysterious about that because there's different photographers and they have different accounts of exactly how the autopsy takes place. Is that right?
Oh, yeah. I mean, Here's another piece of this that as you start reading it, you say, there is something not right in Denmark here. I mean, something rotten in Denmark. Because you've got the official photographer, a guy named John Stringer, who looks at the photograph. Now, this is the guy that takes the photographs of the autopsy. He works for the Navy. My vague recollection is he's a civilian photographer, but expert. He teaches classes for the Navy in photography and so forth. So the guy really knows what he's doing. He's a professional. He looks at these photographs later on when he's testifying before the Assassination Records Review Board, and he says, those are not my photographs. I didn't take those photographs. And so it's like, what the heck's going on here? Here's another mystery on this thing. And he says, I use a certain kind of film, I use a certain kind of camera, this is not my stuff. Well, then you've got another guy that pops up during the Assassination Records Review Board that had testified before the House of Kennedy. It was Robert Knudsen. Now, Knudsen's a very reputable, prominent guy. He's the official social photographer for the president, for President Kennedy. He's going in there taking pictures of the kids, of Carolyn and John, and he follows the family around. So the guy's a very reputable, prominent guy. He tells his family that he was summoned on the 22nd of November to go take pictures for the Kennedy autopsy. He later, in the 70s, tells a national photographic magazine, I was the photographer for the autopsy. Well, Stringer says, I was the only photographer here. He never saw Knudsen. And Knudsen, of course, never saw Stringer. So you have these two different photographers saying, we were the ones who took the pictures. Now, they never got to take Knudsen's deposition before the ARRB because, unfortunately, he had passed away before the ARRB came into existence. And when they took his deposition before the House Select Committee, they scrupulously avoided asking him if he had taken any photographs. They just spent all the time on whether he had developed photographs. Now, let me say one more thing about the photographs. There's a lady named Sandra Spencer that is about the most credible witness you would ever find. She is working she's a Navy personnel, enlisted person, who's working in the official Navy Photographic Center in Washington. And as part of her job, she liaisons with the White House. In fact, after the assassination, she was working closely with Mrs. Kennedy to prepare some kind of cards relating to the funeral. And so this lady is like total credible. She testifies before the Assassination Records Review Board, of course, in the 90s, and she's asked to look at these photographs, these official photographs showing the back of the head. She says, those are not the photographs I developed. She was asked to develop photographs. They came to her and at this national photograph. She understands it's all classified. They tell her, we don't want you focusing on what's in the photographs. Just develop them. Don't spend any time studying them. Well, she says she can't help but look at them. I mean, she's developing them. And she says, those are not the photographs. She says, the photographs I developed showed a hole in the back, big hole in the back of Kennedy's head. Yeah, so when you look at these things, we're not talking about wow theories, conspiracy theories. All I've done with my book is say, let's just examine the evidence and see where the evidence takes us. I mean, I got a law background, so that's how I think. I want to see the evidence. And that's what I do. I recapitulate what people's testimony was, what the physical evidence is. And so you got to ask yourself, what's going on here? The doctor's lying? Are they mistaken? Did they imagine a hole there? Did Sandra Spencer over in Washington imagine a hole in the photographs? Did the Bethesda doctors imagine a hole? Or are these falsified photographs? And I say the great weight of the evidence leads toward falsification.
It's hard to construct any scenario in which you can account for all the discrepancies between Dallas and Bethesda doctors, between the two photographers and the developer, and all these other people as to what actually what condition the body was in, and who did what to it, and when it arrived. And it's hard to imagine a scenario that explains that and does not involve foul play. Like I'm racking my brain for an alternative.
It's virtually impossible because it happened so quickly. I mean, this is not something where, you know, there's an assassination and a month later there's this falsified autopsy. It happened just a few hours after the assassination, and so you know, let's say they think that Fidel Castro has assassinated Kennedy. Well, are they going to sit there within the few hours of the assassination and say, you know, I bet this was Castro, let's cover up for him? Well, it makes no sense. And the same with Khrushchev. If they suspected Khrushchev do it, they're not going to cover up for Khrushchev in the U.S. military. They hated Khrushchev. Even the mafia, you know, because that's a common theory, the mafia did this. What are the chances that the government would ever, in a short period of time, have these deliberations saying, hey, I think the mafia did this, let's cover up for the mafia? It makes no sense. I mean, we all know what happens when somebody kills a federal official or a cop kills a cop. They pull out all the armaments. They do everything they can to find the killer. They violate all kinds of rights and everything because you can't have this happening. Well, here's a president that's killed, and all of a sudden the attitude totally changes. Is that we have to cover this up. And so, I say, who else would they be covering up for except themselves?
Wow.
There is no other logical conclusion on it.
It's a terrifying prospect. Okay, so we have a question in from Rachel Mills of Liberty After Dark fame. She's a podcaster on liberty.me, and she asks almost before we started this conversation, was JFK an inside job? And you just said you think it kind of has to be, or at least the cover-up itself has to be an inside job. And then, you know, who else are they covering up for? And then she asks kind of why would whoever killed him want to kill him? I mean, why would somebody who has the ability to falsify the autopsy, falsify the Warren report, and so on, go out and kill Kennedy? And she asks, was it because he had launched a credible attack on the Federal Reserve?
Yeah, I've heard that theory, and I know that people have discussed it. Of course, there can always be a number of factors involved in motivation. But I think there's a much stronger case to be made for what Kennedy was doing with respect to the Cold War. And another ebook that we launched at the same time that we launched the Kennedy Autopsy, which is the book we're discussing tonight, we launched an ebook called Why JFK's War with the National Security Establishment, Why Kennedy Was Assassinated, by Douglas Horne, the person I mentioned earlier who served on the ARRB. And that goes into motive. And in the new book that I've come out with just in the last couple of weeks, Regime Change, the JFK assassination, I go into motive as well. But Horne's book focuses only on motive. And the idea is this, that after the Kennedy was having trouble with the CIA and the military throughout his regime. There really was a war between the executive branch of the government and the national security branch of the government. After the Bay of Pigs, Kennedy took responsibility, but he was furious. As I go into in Regime Change, the new book, they had double-crossed him. They had led him to believe that this could be successful without air support, and thinking they could manipulate him into providing the air support. He refused to do that. They got massacred and captured. And so he said, I'm going to tear the CIA into 1,000 pieces. Those were his exact words. And he fires the CIA director, Allen Dulles, who was a revered figure in the CIA. He fires the second guy in command, a guy named Bissell. He sends another guy to the Pentagon. And so he never trusts the CIA again. And then he starts having trouble with the military. The Joint Chiefs of Staff present him with plans to invade Cuba. They present him with this weird plan called Operation Northwoods. It calls for fake terrorist attacks that are going to be blamed, and fake plane hijacking that are going to be blamed on Castro. You know, Castro's going to be made a patsy here. And Kennedy just rejects all this. But he keeps going on with this regime change operation. He's still operating out of the Cold War. Which, of course, was the driving force in the 60s, the anti-communist crusade. Well, after the Cuban Missile Crisis, which brought the world to the brink of nuclear disaster, and the very, very brink. I mean, the military wanted Kennedy to attack Cuba during that crisis, and Kennedy kept saying, no, no. Well, it turns out, as people discovered 30 years later or so, if he had invaded Cuba, there was no question there would have been all-out nuclear war. Because what nobody knew, including the CIA, was that the commanders on the ground, the Soviet commanders, had been given battlefield authority to use nuclear weapons to attack invading troops. Well, one nuclear weapon, and that would have been it. And so Kennedy was seared by this experience, as well as Khrushchev. So they decide, Kennedy has this breakthrough where he says, this is just a bunch of bull, this whole Cold War, the whole mindset of this. So he decides that he's going to reach out and try to end the Cold War. And he issues this great speech at American University called the Peace Speech. And you read that and you realize this is a changed man. And he's circumventing the military. He's circumventing the CIA. He starts doing secret negotiations with Khrushchev without involving without even telling the CIA and the military. He does the same thing with Castro. So he enters a nuclear test ban treaty. He suggests that the Soviets go to and the Americans go to the moon together. He was jeopardizing and threatening everything the national security establishment believed in. The whole, you can't trust a communist. We've got to win this war. We can't settle. He's going to disarm America. He's a traitor. He's weak. He's cowardly. He wouldn't attack Cuba. That is where the motive comes in. Is that they considered Kennedy a threat to national security. That was really a much graver threat when you compare what Kennedy was doing to Mossadegh in Iran, who they ousted, Pinochet in Chile, who they ousted. Kennedy posed a much graver threat to national security in terms of the communist threat than either of those two guys, or for that matter, Arbenz in Guatemala, who they ousted for reaching out to the Soviets, getting weapons from Czechoslovakia and so forth. They did not want this Cold War ended because for them, the only way to win this Cold War was through military might, through force. That was the motive.
So, in a sense, it's not like, from your perspective, it's not like a nefarious supervillain plot, like they're trying to destroy the world, but that the guys who are running the national security establishment, whether it's the CIA, the guys at the Pentagon, they actually think that you have to win the Cold War. You can't have a peaceful resolution to it. Is that what? And when Kennedy starts making moves towards a peaceful resolution, they think he's just appeasing and he's going to end up killing us all. Is that what you mean?
Absolutely, and you see his and General LeMay even brought this up. He brings up in the midst of the Cuban Missile Crisis, he brings up Munich, which was a really pointed barb to be making to a guy who was supposedly his boss, because Kennedy's father had supported Chamberlain and the deal that was reached at Munich, and so this was like a little attack, insult at Kennedy, and so yeah. But you got to understand, some of the attacks come in. I know one commenter on my Kennedy Autopsy book on Amazon said, "Oh, I can't believe that anybody would suggest that our military and our CIA would engage in such treasonous action." They don't get it. When they effect a regime change, they are acting as patriots. In their minds, they're protecting the country. They're protecting national security. And for those people that say, "Well, this is just inconceivable," I always point to Chile, and this is where the Chilean national security operation comes into play. In Chile, you had essentially the same situation. You had the national security state, the military and the intelligence forces, attack the president to remove him from office. They do it differently. They didn't do it through assassination. They did it through military planes firing weapons, bombs, missiles into the National Palace on the president's position in the attempt to kill him in order to oust him from power. Now, why did they do that? Not because they're villains or whatever. In their mind, they were protecting the country from a communist, and even worse, a guy who was reaching out to the Soviet Union to establish good relations. Now, why were they doing that? They were doing it because the U.S. government instigated this. At the School of the Americas, they were teaching Chilean military officials, you have a duty to do this. You have a duty to oust your president from office. Forget the Constitution. Forget the law. The Constitution is not a suicide pact. You need to go in there and save the country by removing your president. Now, that's a fascinating insight into their mindset, because they truly believed that their job is to protect national security and to defend the country from all enemies, foreign and domestic. Now, what happens if you get the worst case scenario and a president reaches office because of a mistake of the electorate, who turns out to be a weakling, incompetent, young, is making bad decisions that is going to end up surrendering America to the communists? What choice do they have except to say, we've got to save our country, the same way that the Chilean military would save its country some 10 years later?
Okay, so this is pretty in-depth stuff. I want to take a moment here and talk about two background features that we've been dancing around so far, we haven't zoomed in on yet. One is that we're talking about the Kennedy Autopsy in particular tonight, or at least we started talking about that. But this is actually one of 3 books that Triple F has produced, and full disclosure, I was involved in helping getting these books out as a publishing consultant. So there's 3 books, right? So there's the Kennedy Autopsy, which we're talking about tonight, and it released at the same time as that, as the other one you mentioned, JFK's War, the why Kennedy was assassinated. But now there's this 3rd new book, which you call Regime Change. Can you tell us just a bit about Regime Change, where you pack more of your kind of broader explanation of the Kennedy assassination in?
Yeah, and let me thank you, Mike. I mean, these books are so nicely formatted, and we were so surprised when Kennedy Autopsy and JFK's War with the National Security Establishment started taking off. I mean, we had no idea this was going to happen. We did no promotion on these books at all. We just launched them. And all of a sudden, you contacted us and said, do y'all realize what's happening with these books? The sales were just taking off, and I hadn't even looked at the ebook, and I went and looked at it, and I said, my gosh, this is such a nice job of formatting and the way it was presented, and that was you, and I thank you for doing that, and I have no doubts that that contributed to the success of these 2 books. And so, yeah, all of a sudden, by January, the 2 books are on Amazon's top 100 bestsellers of 20th century American history, and they're still there. They've been there since January. So I figured, okay, we've got these 2 books, but there's people out there, and I've encountered them that said, man, I don't want to get into the Kennedy assassination. There's so many books on this, and there are, and it's hard to know where to start, and I just don't want to deal with this. But people have to deal with it because it's part of our history. It's part of the national security establishment, which I consider is the gravest threat to our freedom. And so I said, why don't I come up with a primer, essentially a primer, that explains what we're talking about tonight to the average person that hasn't delved into this and studied it and so forth. And I start out by saying, here are the facts of the assassination, the basic facts. Here is the thesis that I'm presenting, that this was a regime change operation. This is the motive. This is what I considered, what we haven't gotten into, is I consider the most ingenious plan that I've ever encountered. It's incredible what their strategy was here in terms of, one of the popular questions that I answer in the book is, why, if you're going to set up a patsy in the rear, and my thesis is that Oswald was exactly who he said he was. He was a patsy. That if you're going to set up a patsy in the rear, why have shots fired from the front? And I explain that in the book. I explain it is absolutely an ingenious reason as to why they did this. And then I have a chapter on the autopsy, but it's not as detailed as the Kennedy autopsy, but then it puts it in the context of other regime change operations. This was the objective of the CIA. It still is regime change. That wasn't designed that way. Nobody intended the CIA to do this, but it turned out that they saw their job as protecting national security by effecting regime changes in countries around the world, including through assassination. And the assassination program. It went on for a long time before the Kennedy assassination. In fact, as I point out in the book, what a lot of people don't know is that the CIA actually entered into a partnership with the mafia to kill Castro. And so, yeah, it's incredible. I mean, here's this criminal organization they enter into a partnership with, which really isn't too unusual because the Batista regime that Castro had ousted was in bed with the mafia, and the Batista regime was in cahoots with the U.S. government, but it wasn't that difficult. So people say, well, how could they have gotten the mafia to participate in this, like through Jack Ruby's assassination of Oswald? Well, it's not difficult at all. They already had a working partnership.
Wow. So, okay, so I want to tell people how to get to the Kennedy Autopsy, which is free right now if you're a Liberty.me member. And I want to tell people how to get to Regime Change, which is 99 cents right now on Amazon.com. But I also want to give people the info they need to ask us some more questions. I know Rachel's got another one. So I'm going to just take a moment and explain some of the infrastructure here that most people may not be aware of already. We're broadcasting the show actually simultaneously in 3 places. So you might be watching me and Jacob right now on Google+, or you might be watching the live stream, which is going live to YouTube instantly, or you might be watching us on Liberty.me, where the YouTube live stream is embedded. And wherever you're seeing us is just fine, and I'm just delighted that all you guys are with us. When you want to ask a question, what I like to do in these shows is I like to do what I call a crowdsourced interview, which is, it starts with Jacob and me talking, or me and whoever my guest is, and I'm asking the questions, but over time the audience brings in more and more questions. I like to answer those, so I want to get some more of those. To ask a question, you need to follow just 4 simple steps. It's a little counterintuitive, but I'm going to walk you all through it. So the first step is to get to Google+. You can only ask questions via Google+. So I'm going to show you what it looks like if you're watching on Liberty.me. There's a funny little picture of me here in the middle of the show. If you're watching on Liberty.me, or if you're watching on YouTube, it's in the same place. The first line of the description gives you the link to go and watch it on Google+. You can go ask a question. So here's that link to Google+. I'm just going to click that. Takes me over here. Here's the Google Plus page. I think most of our viewers are watching that right now. I can see Lucy and Grant and Alan McDonald are in here. And so here I am. Now I'm clicking on the video itself to expand it. It's going to be a little funny because I'm going to see a delayed picture of myself. And then you just see the funny thing is there's this little Rubik's Cube in the back. See this little Rubik's Cube up here? It's got 9 little squares. You click on that one. You click on Q&A, that's step 3. Step 4 is you actually ask the question. Oh, you can see there's already a new one from Rachel. And great, then you submit. And I guess step 5 is we answer the question. So if you have a question for us, please go ahead, head over to the Google Plus page, click on that little 9-point square there, and ask us away. We'd just love to address it. Or actually, Jacob would love to address it, and I'd love to make him do it. Great.
Mike?
Okay, so we're back now. So the books. Let me tell you guys how to get to the JFK Autopsy book and the Regime Change book. Wherever you're looking, if you're looking on the Google Plus page, you're looking on the YouTube page, or if you're looking on the Liberty.me page, right on the description it tells you get the Kennedy Autopsy for free because you're a Liberty.me member. So you can go right ahead and go and get that if you're a Liberty.me member. If you're not a Liberty.me member yet, you can go sign up. You get a free month of Liberty.me, and then bingo bango, you can go ahead and get the book for free. So it's free for free. The other thing is the Regime Change book. Again, that link is right there in the description if you're watching on YouTube or Google Plus or on Liberty.me, and that link will take you right to Amazon.com where you can buy Regime Change. Now, Regime Change's price is normally $4.99, but after long conversations, I talked Jacob into lowering the price for 24 hours around this event to 99 cents. You guys can go buy it now. First thing I'm going to do tomorrow morning, I'm going to go put that price back up where it's supposed to be. So I encourage you to go and get that one right now or right after the show while you can get it at the discount. Okay, so that's how people can actually get the books that we're talking about, and that's how people can ask questions. But I've already got a new one from Rachel here. So Rachel asks, how should a future president defend themselves from this kind of thing happening again? I mean, it's a little bit scary if you're a person who believes in the political process to bring about a peaceful libertarian society in the United States. It's scary to imagine that, yeah, you can get a guy elected, but if he goes too far, the CIA might decide that he's a danger to the country and get rid of him.
There's no question about it that every president since the Kennedy assassination, in fact, everybody in Washington has had to factor in that there's a new sheriff in town, that there's a new national security branch of government in town. And the fact is that nobody can protect themselves against the national security branch. There's a new book out called National Security and Double Government by a professor from Tufts named Glennon that is a fantastic book. And it's very, very insightful, and this isn't a conspiracy theory guy. It's not about the assassination. He just talks about there's two parts of the government, the Trumanite section, which is the national security section, and then the Madisonian section, which is the original section that the government was built on out of the Constitution. And what he says is that when the Trumanite section came into existence after the end of World War II, that's where all the power ended up going. And he analyzed it in terms of data collection, that all the information is going to the NSA, the CIA, the monitoring agencies. But they maintain this aura. Everybody plays this game that everything's the same as before. That the Madisonian section, they make it look like the Supreme Court's in charge and so forth. But Glennon makes it very clear that everything was revolutionized with the Trumanite section. What he doesn't go into, though, is what I go into, is that there's another factor here. The National Security Branch is the most powerful branch. It has the guns, the tanks, the weapons, the planes. If you want to see what that means, go look at the Chilean coup. The president got into a fight with the National Security Branch. They're supposed to be working for him, right? We always think of the military as part of the executive branch. As a practical matter, it's a separate branch. Because if there's a fight between the president and the National Security Branch, we all know who's going to win. Look at Chile. And so the fact is that as a de facto matter, even though the Constitution doesn't provide for it, that when you brought this National Security Branch into existence, it fundamentally altered America's governmental system. It revolutionized the system. It now is the final arbiter of national security. The courts don't interfere with them. The courts have made it very clear, we're not touching them. And so they call it the political question doctrine. They can go out and assassinate anyone, and the courts say, we're not touching it. It's a political question, we're not going to touch it. Congress isn't going to touch it. So to answer Rachel's question, there's only one real solution to this, and that is to return to the founding principles of this country and dismantle this totalitarian-like apparatus, the whole national security state apparatus. There's no other solution. You got to abolish the CIA. You got to abolish the huge standing army. You got to return to a non-interventionist foreign policy. So you're never going to find the exact people who shot Kennedy. That's gone. But you can restore what this country was supposed to be all about. And certainly because the Cold War's over. I mean, the whole national security state apparatus was brought into existence because of the Cold War. I question whether they should have done that. But one thing's clear. The Cold War is over, and all they're doing is creating more problems around the world that are then used as the excuse to take away our freedoms at home. So there's only one way a president can protect himself, and that's to get this whole thing dismantled.
Okay, so this reminds me of what we've recently learned about dirty tactics in Wisconsin, and this is not about a national security thing, but I think it plays in here. So during the reign of Scott Walker, there was a series of conservative activists who were encouraging him and doing research for him and so on to cut the pensions of the teachers' union, the police union, and that kind of thing. And we've just learned, like the news just came out in the last couple of days, that several kind of conservative activists who were trying to kind of dismantle the kind of local Wisconsin big government programs found themselves the target of quite vicious investigations that were clearly politically motivated, and investigations which, according to the law, they were forbidden from discussing, which is why we've only learned about it now, not when they were going on in, I think, 2008, 2009. So it seems to me like there's a chicken and egg problem, and if you accept what you're saying, that it's important to dismantle the national security state, when you start dismantling the national security state, you say to all the CIA guys, okay, you guys are out of a job, all the NSA guys who have your phone records, you guys are out of a job. I mean, are they going to stand for that?
You've hit the nail on the head, and that's the way I conclude my book, Regime Change, is that now that you've brought this monstrosity into existence, what are the chances that it would go peacefully in the night if all of a sudden Congress voted to repeal the National Security Act of 1947, voted to abolish the CIA? I mean, if their job is to protect national security, they today consider a 10% cut in their budgets a threat to national security. So is the military. Now,
Right.
suppose all of a sudden they're faced with abolition. If they consider a 10% cut, then clearly they would consider a 98% cut a threat to national security. And then are they going to stand by and let the electorate do what they consider is an irresponsible thing, or are they going to voluntarily dismantle and comply with the law? And see, this is another fallacy of the Warren Commission, is that the Warren Commission never had a chance in terms of targeting the CIA and the military, which they should have done as a target of interest. Hey, you should be investigated like anybody else. But everybody knew what was going on. Imagine if the Warren Commission had targeted the CIA at the height of the Cold War. Imagine the headlines. Warren Commission used CIA, president and subpoenas records. Well, so the Warren Commission sends out a couple of U.S. Marshals to Langley. What happens if those Marshals meet a team of CIA sharpshooters and the 82nd Airborne Division there? I mean, who's going to win that battle? And so there was really never a possibility that the Warren Commission was going to do that. Well, especially since you got Alan Dulles, the guy that Kennedy had fired on the Warren Commission, total conflict of interest. You got all these establishment figures that would never, ever take the chance of being called a conspiracy theorist. So that's been from the beginning.
Wow. Wow, that's a stark analysis. So you talk at the beginning. I asked you, what the Future Freedom Foundation does, and you said that you're big believers in the role of ideas in shaping the future. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, that ideas move the world for better or for worse. And I often hear people, especially in the libertarian movement, oh, we don't have a chance. It's too powerful. It's too big. There's nothing we can do. Let's just hope, put our faith in the younger generation, and they'll achieve freedom sometime in the future. Well, the younger generation is no different from us. They get old, and all of a sudden, they're going to be saying the same thing. Oh, let's put our faith in the young people. We can achieve freedom in our time. This is a movement that's been going on a long time. The libertarian movement, many decades. In fact, when people were fighting for liberty and libertarianism back in the 40s, they were saying, let's put our faith in young people. In other words, so how do we do this? Well, look, Mike, this country lived under a government. I'm not saying it was a perfect government. We all know it wasn't. But we did live under a system where there was no income tax, no welfare, no Medicare, no Medicaid, no drug wars, no immigration controls, no gun control, no national military establishment, no foreign interventionism, no torture, assassination, CIA, NSA. All right, then the progressives and the interventionists come in with bad ideas. They get a welfare state coming in. They get a warfare state coming in. And now we have the results. I mean, it's a disaster. They're spending our country into bankruptcy. They're affecting regime change operations. They're assassinating people without any kind of due process. This is not what a free society is all about. Okay, well, if they could use bad ideas to move America to where we are today, certainly we can use good ideas to move America back in the good direction. And we already see that happening in the drug war. 25 years ago, and if you call for drug legalization, you were crazy. Today, it's on the table. It's a legitimate position. 2 states have legalized marijuana. Same with gun control. You see the public opinion polls moving toward against gun control. This is the power of ideas. This is what we rely on at the Future of Freedom Foundation.
Wow, that's beautiful. That's beautiful. Jacob, I've got to wrap it up in a few minutes, and let me tell you what I'd like to do to wrap it up. I want to start by telling everybody how to get more great Jacob Hornberger stuff and more great Triple F stuff, Future Freedom Foundation. And then I'm going to tell them about a couple other things that are coming up soon on Liberty.me Live, and then I'll turn it back over to you, Jacob, and you can give us the final word before we close out. Okay, so where to get more Jacob Hornberger. So first of all, if you're looking at YouTube or Google Plus or Liberty.me, right in the description of the show, you've got the two linked books. The book we've been talking about tonight, especially the Kennedy Autopsy, which is the book that is free to you if you're a Liberty.me member right now. If you're not a Liberty.me member right now, you can go to that link. You can, if you click the download, you'll get a join page. You can join us. You get a free month. You get a free book with the free month. What more do you want from us? So there's that. There's also the other linked book, Regime Change, which I've talked Jacob into putting down to 99 cents, but I got to put it back up to $4.99 tomorrow morning. So there's a good chance to get it tonight before you go to sleep. So that's the books in particular. But if you want to get more Jacob Hornberger stuff more broadly, more of his work at the Future Freedom Foundation, the site to go to is fff.org. fff.org. That's the Future Freedom Foundation's great, beautiful website. I encourage you to go check that out. There's just about every day. There's a new blog post by Jacob Hornberger. There's beautiful stuff there. You can see lots of great articles. Wendy McElroy has been in there. Sheldon Richmond, Fergus Hodgson, you name it, they've been there. Joe Diedrich, our own Liberty.me's own G. Diedrich, has been in there. So I encourage everybody to check that out. Now, I also got to tell you just a little bit about two things coming up on Liberty.me Live in the near future. In the very, very near future, about 30 minutes from now, we have Bourbon and Fine Ladies. Tiffany Madison, Tiffany and Lucy Steigerwald, who I know is in the audience tonight, and also their guest, Carrie Wedler, are coming on in just about half an hour on Liberty.me Live to do a show kind of like this, but they tend to drink a lot during the show. So it gets a little crazy here pretty quickly. Then a little bit later next week on Tuesday, we haven't got the post up because we haven't nailed the time down yet, but I'm back with Walter Block, and I'm going to be talking with Walter Block again. I don't know if I can pry him away from praising Rand Paul or if that's what he's going to do the whole time. And then finally, I got to let everybody know that on Friday night, if you go down to Liberty.me Live, which is Liberty.me/live, next Friday night, so a week and a day from now, you can come to our Free Spirits birthday party. Liberty.me is officially 1 year old when we're holding a birthday party on May the 1st, and you are invited. So come on down to that too. Okay, so that's how to get more Jacob Hornberger. That's how to get more Liberty.me Live. I'm done. Thank you so much, Jacob. I'll turn the mic over to you for the last bit.
Well, I just want to thank you, Mike, and thank Liberty.me. It's just a big honor to be here. I've been keeping up with what you guys are doing, and it's just absolutely awesome, and it's nice to be here to participate in this, and thank you for having me on. And I think that the way we're going to achieve the free society is not because of some great big design that somebody comes up with, like a plan, a central plan for liberty. It's going to be because of the results of human action, like Hayek said, not of human design. And those human actions is everybody in the libertarian movement doing his part, whatever that may be, to advance liberty. And when you multiply that across the country, all of a sudden you're talking about a huge movement because there's hundreds of thousands of people out there doing this. But one of the big organizations that's doing that is Liberty.me with y'all's videos and stuff. It's absolutely fantastic, and I'm glad to be a part of it, and thanks for having me on.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Jacob. Okay, all right, everybody. Have a great night. I'll see you over at Bourbon and Fine Ladies.
Literature that had been published by the Foundation for Economic Education, and they had a profound impact on me on the welfare state and the notion that we're not really free in this country because of this kind of socialistic economic system, interventionist, mercantilist, corporatist. And that was a big revelation for me when I was in my 20s and I discovered libertarianism. But as time went on, I realized that as bad as it is verging on liberty, it pales in comparison to the other side of the equation, and that's what we call the warfare state or the national security state. And unfortunately, a lot of libertarians stay stuck only on economics. They have a blind spot to the grave threat to our liberties that are posed by the national security state, a much graver threat. So this caused me to delve much more deeply into the national security state, and at FFF I would say we probably spend 60% of our time on the warfare state and about 40% on economic liberty. And in the context of studying the national security state, the CIA, the military-industrial complex, as President Eisenhower said, the whole standing army, the NSA, you get into the concepts of regime change and assassination. And so right in the middle of this falls the Kennedy assassination. And some libertarians might look at the assassination and say, well, it's something different.
Possible. So that's the point. As I read the book, that's the point where I really got into it. I really realized I had to pay attention to the whole thing, get all the details here. So Jacob, don't answer that yet. Don't tell us how that's possible yet. Audience, stay tuned and you'll find out. But first I want to take just a step back and just get to know Jacob for a moment. Jacob, can you tell us a little bit about who you are and what your organization, the Future of Freedom Foundation, is all about?
Yeah, I'm president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, which I founded some 25 years ago. And it's a nonprofit educational foundation. We're libertarians. We advance what we call an uncompromising moral, philosophical, and economic case for the free society. And we do that through a variety of methods, but primarily through the dissemination of ideas, which we have ultimate faith in, the power of ideas, on, especially ideas on liberty.
Wow. Wow, that's interesting. So how does this book, and indeed you've done a lot of research over the years and a lot of writing on specifically the Kennedy assassination, the autopsy, and those details, but also you've done some work about CIA coups in Latin America especially. How does that kind of detailed historical work fit into what's going on in the Future of Freedom Foundation in general?
Well, most of us get into this movement through the economic side of things. That's certainly the way I got into it, discovery. So if they're hearing shots from the front, well, that indicates there's more than one shooter here. But what's fascinating about the autopsy is that it comes at the assassination and figuring out what happened sort of from the back angle of this thing after the assassination. And the analysis is this, is that if you look at the evidence of the autopsy and you conclude that a false and fraudulent autopsy was conducted, then that automatically means cover-up. I mean, there's no way to avoid that conclusion. That if they're going to false an autopsy, they're doing it for a reason, and there can be only one reason. That's cover-up. Well, that's what the purpose of my book is, the Kennedy Autopsy, is to look at that evidence. It doesn't go into theories and conspiracy theories. It just says, let's look at this evidence. And the great way of the evidence that's come out over the last many, many years, most of it was kept secret, is yes, there was a false and fraudulent autopsy. Well, then that raises the natural questions, is why would they cover up? Who were they trying to cover up for? And that leads directly to themselves, to the national security establishment.
Wow. So let's go to the autopsy itself. Let's go to my teaser about the 2 deliveries of the body to Bethesda Naval Hospital in Maryland, right? Can you talk about kind of the custody of Kennedy's body from the time he dies to the time and it doesn't really fit in with what we're doing. But once you start realizing that it fits perfectly because it was just another regime change operation, no different from other regime change operations that the CIA and the military was doing, then you start realizing, my gosh, this branch of the government really is the most powerful branch, and that's the national security branch. Wow. Okay, so you were kind of going right away to the big stuff, explaining that you think the best explanation for the assassination and the kind of what happens, the shenanigans in the autopsy and the following investigations, is that the national security state itself, or be that the CIA or the Pentagon or I don't know, the companies that make Agent Orange, were involved in killing Kennedy and then covering up the evidence. Is that right?
Yeah, and that's exactly right. They effected a regime change operation, no different from the one in Guatemala in '54, in Iran in '53, in Chile in '73, and the ones they were trying to effect in Cuba throughout the '60s. And the key to understanding this, or a key to understanding this, is the autopsy, which is why I wrote this book. Because as you look at it, in other words, you can try to come at the assassination from the front side by saying, well, look how many police officers heard shots from the front. And, of course, Oswald was in the...
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Liberty.me Live. I'm your host tonight, Mike Reed, and I'm here with Jacob Hornberger, the president of the Future Freedom Foundation. We're going to talk tonight about Jacob's fascinating Kindle bestseller, The Kennedy Autopsy. I've been storing it here on my Kindle. And welcome, Jacob, and thanks for coming on.
Oh, thank you. It's great to be here. My first time on Liberty.me. I'm excited.
Wonderful. Now, my dear audience, we're going to get right deep into this book, into the mysteries surrounding the Kennedy assassination, the autopsy, how this all connects to the liberty movement in general. But I want to give you a little teaser before we really get started. So here's the thing that shocked me most about this book when I read it. On November 22nd, so the day of Kennedy's assassination, after he's been pronounced dead at the hospital, first his body gets taken elsewhere for an autopsy. That's a little bit weird. And here's what's really weird. When his body arrives at the new hospital for the autopsy, it arrives for the autopsy twice, in two different caskets on the same night. It shows up first in this plain, like, unmarked shipping casket, and then it arrives the second time, just a little while later, in a bronze ornate casket, the same one everybody saw it kind of loaded onto the plane in Dallas in. So the same body arrives at the same hospital twice, delivered twice, for the same autopsy in the same night. Like, how would that even